In this section, we're going to add authentication and authorization to our application using ASP.NET Identity Framework. You will learn how ASP.NET Identity works under the hood and how you can customize it for your applications. Now, let's get started. Okay, let's start by defining the problem we're going to solve. This Ridley application we have built so far is supposed to be running in a video rental store. So the person at the counter will use this application to record customers, rentals, returns, and so on. Now, first of all, we want to restrict all these capabilities to a logged-in user. So if someone is not behind the counter and the computer is unattended, we don't want an anonymous user to browse the list of customers, add a customer, and whatnot. Also, to make this a bit more interesting and more real world, I want to define a role like store manager and limit adding, updating, and deleting the movies only to someone in this role. So we don't want a new staff to modify our stock of movies because a lot of shady things can happen. Now that we have an understanding of the problem we're going to solve, let's see what options we have in front of us. When we first created our project, we had a dialog box like this. In this dialog box, we had a button called Change Authentication, and we didn't look at this at the beginning. So let's have a look at different authentication options supported in ASP.NET MVC applications. As you see, we have 4 different authentication options here. We have no authentication, which is used for applications that don't need any authentication services and are accessible to anonymous users. We have individual user accounts, which is the default authentication option for ASP.NET MVC projects. And this is suitable for internet websites, where you want to provide a form for the user to log in. With this option, you can also enable social logins, such as Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on. We have organizational accounts, which is useful if you want to enable single sign-on for internal and cloud apps using Active Directory. And finally, we have Windows authentication, which is useful for intranet applications. In this setup, when the user logs into their desktop computer on the network, they will be authenticated to your application automatically. Now, as far as I know, in Visual Studio 2013, you can access this dialog box only during the creation of your project. In Visual Studio 2012, we could change it later on, but I don't know why Microsoft decided to drop this feature. And I'm not sure if they have added that in Visual Studio 2015. Now, that aside, from these authentication options, individual user accounts is most common. So I'm going to dedicate the rest of this section in examining this option in detail. If you want to learn about organizational accounts or Windows authentication, I have added a couple of links for you at the end of this section. Okay, now let me show you something. In Vidly, did you notice these 2 links on the navigation bar? Register and login. Every ASP.NET MVC application by default has these features. So I can register as a new user. And look, as soon as I register, I'm automatically signed in. I can log off and log in again. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to build all these registration forms, log in, log out, and whatnot. Now, throughout the rest of this section, I'm going to show you how all these features work internally and how you can customize them based on the needs of your application. So how does this registration feature work under the hood? Well, this is part of a framework called ASP.NET Identity, which used to be called ASP.NET Membership. But ASP.NET Membership had quite a few number of design issues, and it has gone through a few redesigns over the past few years, and the outcome of all these redesigns is ASP.NET Identity. If you look at the references of our project, you see 3 assemblies that start with Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity. These assemblies represent ASP.NET Identity Framework. Now, in terms of architecture, ASP.NET Identity has a number of domain classes like Identity User and Role, and it provides a simple API to work with these classes. The API consists of classes like User Manager, Role Manager, Sign-in Manager, and so on. These classes internally talk to another group of classes like User Store and Role Store, which represent the persistent store for ASP.NET Identity. Now, ASP.NET Identity provides an implementation of this persistent store using Entity Framework and a relational SQL database. But you can also plug in your own implementation of a persistent store, like a NoSQL data store. Now, if you remember, the very first time we created a migration, we got all these tables in our migration, like ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET user roles, ASP.NET users, and so on. These tables are generated based on the domain model of ASP.NET Identity Framework. So if we go to our models folder and look at identity models, you see we have application user, which derives from identity user, and we also have application DB context, which derives from identity DB context. Both these classes, identity user and identity DB context, are part of ASP.NET Identity Framework. And that's why the first time we created a migration, we got these tables as part of our migration. Now let me show you something. In controllers folder, account controller. This controller exposes a number of actions like register, login, log off, and so on. Let's take a look at the register action. So we have two register actions, one without a parameter, which is used for loading the registration form. So here we are simply returning the view. And as you might guess, in Solution Explorer, if you go to Views, Account, we've got a bunch of views that are used by our account controller. Now back here, here's the other register action, which is called when we post a form. Let's take a look at the logic here. So if model state is valid, we create a new application user and initialize its username and email properties. Next, we call the create async method of user manager. This is an asynchronous method. That's why we have this async keyword in the method name. And for that, we have to await it. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, check out my C# advanced course on Udemy. So this user manager is part of the API that we use to work with users. It has methods for creating a user, getting a user, removing a user, and so on. Now, if the call to create async method is successful, we use another manager, sign in manager, which is responsible for operations like sign in, sign out, and so on. So we call sign in async. And because of this line here, when I registered, I was logged in automatically. If you don't want this behavior in your application, you can comment out this line and use this sample code below. With this, you can send a confirmation email to the user so they can verify their email address. So this is ASP.NET Identity in a nutshell. Next, I'm going to show you how to disable anonymous access in our application. In ASP.NET MVC, we have an attribute called authorize. Well, more accurately, we call it a filter. A filter can be applied to an action, and it will be called by the MVC framework before and after that action or its result are executed. So when we apply this attribute to an action, before the action is executed, the attribute will check if the current user is logged in or not. If not, it will redirect the user to the login page. So here I've got customer's controller open. I'm going to apply this attribute to the index action. Now you don't have to type this, just watch what I'm doing. Authorize. Now I'm going to run the application and navigate to the list of customers. So we are redirected to the login page. And look at the URL. Here we have a query string parameter, return URL, which shows where we will be taken to once we successfully log in. So in this case, %2f is the URL encoded of /. So once we successfully log in here, we'll be redirected to /customers. Now, if I remove this attribute here and apply it on the controller, it will be the same as applying it to all actions in this controller. We can also apply this attribute globally. So it will be applied to all controllers and their actions. Now, this is the best practice if most of your application functionality should be protected from anonymous users. This way, when you create a new controller or a new action, you don't have to remember to use this attribute. Now, in case of our application, because we're going to protect most of the application from anonymous users, I'm going to apply this attribute or this filter globally. So delete here. Now, let's go to Solution Explorer. app_start, open up filter config. Here we can register global filters. You can see we already have a global filter called handle error attribute. This filter redirects the user to an error page when an action throws an exception. We're going to look at this later in the course. Now I'm going to add this authorize attribute to the filters collection. So filters.add new authorize attribute. Let's run the application. You can see we can't even get to the home page. So this is very restrictive. Now let's say we want to make the home page accessible to anonymous users. So let's go to home controller. We can apply another attribute here, allow anonymous. Again, you can apply it on the controller or one or more of its actions. Let's run the application again. Okay, now the home page is accessible to everyone, but if I go to customers or movies, I have to log in first. Next, I'm going to show you how to restrict movie management operations to store managers. Okay, so we're going to restrict movie management operations to store managers. First of all, we need to create this role in our application. And more importantly, when we deploy our application, we should have a user assigned to this role. This way, the store manager can start entering movies and then delegate other tasks to the staff. Now, I want you to pay all your attention here and follow every single step I'm going to do. First, I'm going to register a guest user. So guest@vidlay.com. Okay, now back in Visual Studio, go to controllers and open up account controller. From the list of methods, select register method. We're going to modify the logic of this action and assign any new users to the store manager role. Now, you may get freaked out and say, Mosh, but this is too risky. I know, just bear with me. We are going to remove this code in a second. I just want to populate our database with a user in the store manager role. So here, if we successfully create a user, temp code. So earlier, I told you that to work with ASP.NET Identity, we use manager classes like user manager, role manager, and so on. All these managers use a store under the hood. So first I'm going to create a role store. So var role store, new role store. Now this is a generic class, and here we need to specify the type of the role class in our application. Now in this application, we don't have a specific role class. So we use the one that comes with ASP.NET Identity. It's called identity role. And note the namespace. It's in Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity.Entity framework. Now here in the constructor, I'm going to pass a new application DB context. Okay, here's our store. Now we should create a role manager. Role manager, new role manager. Again, this is a generic class. So here we pass identity role as the generic parameter. And in the constructor of the manager, we pass our role store. Now to create the role, we call role manager.create async. Now because we set the generic parameter to identity role, here we need to pass an instance of identity role. And in the constructor, we set the name of the role. I'm going to set this to can manage movies. Hang on a second, what happened to store manager? Well, the best practice is to name these roles after the actual permissions. Store manager is a pretty dry name. And later on, as our application grows and we give different permissions to different roles, we're not going to remember what privileges this role has. But when we use a role name like can manage movies, this is quite obvious. So we call create async, and because this is an async method, we need to await it. Now I'm going to assign this new user to our new role. So we use user manager dot add to role async. Here we need to pass the ID of this user. So user.id and the name of the role, can manage movies. And finally, we await this call. Now let's register a new user. Control F5. I'm going to log off first, register, admin@vidly.com. Okay, beautiful. Now, before we forget, let's go back here and remove these 4 lines. Now we have 2 users, a guest and an admin who can manage movies. We want these users and the new role to be deployed with our application. So how do we do it? Remember the technique we used for populating our database with reference data? We use a code-first migration. So open up Package Manager console, add migration, seed users. Okay, look, this is an empty migration because we have not modified our domain model. Here we're going to use plain SQL to add these 2 users and the corresponding role in our database. Now I show you a quick way to do this. Go to Solution Explorer, click this icon to show all files. In app_data folder, here's our database. Open it, tables, right-click ASP.NET Users, show table data. So here are the 2 users we created. Select both, right-click, script. That's what we need. Copy, back to our migration. SQL, I'm going to use a verbatim string so we can break it up into multiple lines. And simply paste these lines. Now I'm going to repeat. Back to SQL Server Object Explorer. Right-click ASP.NET Roles. View data. Here's our can manage movies role. Script. Select, copy. Paste it here. And finally, we need the record that associates our admin user with the new role. One more time. ASP.NET user roles. That's it. Copy. And paste it here. Now, I'm going to remove these records from the database and then run this migration. This will populate our database with the users and the role. So, ASP.NET roles, delete, and similarly in ASP.NET users, delete these 2 records. Now let's run the migration. Back to Package Manager console, clean up, update database. The beauty of this approach is that if we run these migrations on another database, let's say our testing or production database, we'll have the exact same setup. So this is the proper way to seed our database with users and roles. Now, if you have read some of the tutorials on the ASP.NET website, unfortunately, they show you a poor way to do this. Here's an example. This tutorial, and many other tutorials I have seen on the web, is telling me to use the seed method of the configuration class of code-first migrations to add users and roles to the database. I haven't covered this method in this course because that really belongs to Entity Framework. But basically, when we run update database in Package Manager console, this seed method will get executed. Now, what is wrong with this seed method? Why shouldn't we use it? Because you're not going to execute update database on your production database. If you want to do this, you have to change the connection string in web.config and run update database here. But this is very risky because if you forget to change the connection string back to your development database, you're going to screw your production database. Now, the reason I'm showing you this example is not to criticize Microsoft, but to let you know that there are a lot of poor information on the web. And just because you see a solution on Stack Overflow or even on Microsoft website doesn't mean this is a good solution. You should always think about what you read and choose the right solution wisely. Okay, our database is in the right state. Next, I'm going to show you how to use this new role in controlling authorization. Okay, we want to restrict the add, edit, and delete operations to store managers. Now we have two options here. One way is to show or hide various elements depending on the user's privileges. This works well if you have a simple view. But if you have a complex view, you will end up with a lot of if and else blocks, and this will make your view hard to maintain. In that case, it's better to create an entirely new view for users with less privileges. Now look at this view. We need to hide this button here. Also, in our table, we need to replace this link that takes us to the edit page with another one that takes us to a view page. And we should also hide the third column. So there are quite a few things we need to change here. But more importantly, because we are rendering this table in JavaScript, this is going to get even more complex. So for this scenario, I'm going to create an entirely new view for the staff. So let's go to Views, Movies, Index. Duplicate this view and rename this to Read-Only List. And also for consistency, I would like to rename Index to List. Now let's go to Read-Only List. You should delete this action link that renders the new button. And in our table, we don't need the third column. Delete. Scroll down. In the first column, I'm going to remove this custom render function because I don't want to render this edit link. Now this will render just plain text. You may decide to render a different link that would take the user to view movie page instead of edit movie. Also, we don't need the third column here. And that means we should get rid of this code that handles the click event of the delete buttons. Delete. Done. Let's close this. In Solution Explorer, go to Controllers, Movies Controller. In the index action, we use the user property of our controller, which gives us access to the current user. We call isInRole method. And here we specify the name of our role, can manage movies. Now here we have a magic string, but I'm going to fix that later. Let's just finish up this part. So if the user can manage movies, I'm going to return the list view. Otherwise, read-only list. Now we can also get rid of this else because it's really not required here. Let's test this. Build. Back to the browser. So I'm currently logged in as admin. I'm going to refresh the page. So I get the same view as before. But if I log off and log in as guest, look, as a staff member, I can only view the list of movies. Now, this is the first half of implementing authorization. Our application still has security holes. So as a guest user, I can still go to movies/new. And look, I can add a new movie here. I can also use this Postman plugin and call our API to create a movie or update or delete an existing one. So in Movies controller, we need to decorate these actions like the new action with the authorize attribute. And here we set the roles property, which is a string. And we can pass multiple roles separated by a comma. So again, a magic string can manage movies. The problem with this magic string is that if we decide to change the name of this role, we have to change many different places. And also, if we have a typo, our application is not going to work properly. But we're going to fix that in a second. Now let's build. Back to the browser. So I'm still logged in as a guest. If I refresh this page, I get redirected back to the login page. So I cannot access /movies/new. So this is just one example. You need to apply authorize attribute on other actions like create, edit, update, and delete. And that applies to actions of our Movies API as well. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise for you. Now let's fix this magic strings. So in Solution Explorer, right-click Models and add a new class. I'm going to call this role name. Change this to a static class and add a constant here. Public constant string can manage movies. And we set it to a string. Can manage movies. Now with this, if we decide to change the name of this role, we have to modify only one place. And also we'll reduce the chance of typos. So back in our controller, I'm going to replace this with role name dot can manage movies. And same here. So this is how you implement authorization at the role level. Next, I'm going to show you how to add profile data to ASP.NET Identity users. So this sign-up form we get out of the box is pretty basic. Sometimes we need to capture more data about a new user. So let's introduce a new field here, driving license. Imagine a new staff member should enter their driving license for security reasons. First of all, as I've said before, we always start with the domain. So let's go to the models, open up identity models. Here's our application user. I'm going to add a new property. Driving license. And I'm going to decorate this with the required attribute. Otherwise, it's going to be optional. Also, I would like to add string lengths here. 255 characters. Okay, we have changed our domain. Now we should create a migration. Package Manager console, add migration, add driving license to application user. Update database. Beautiful. Now, in case you're wondering what is going to happen to those existing users we have in the database, what is going to be their driving license? Because we marked this property as required, Entity Framework will set them to an empty string, so they are not null. Okay, so the domain model and the persistent store or database are updated. Next, we work on the view. So let's go to Solution Explorer, Views, Account, Register. Let's scroll down. I'm going to get this form group, which is for the email field, copy, and paste it before our submit button or after confirm password. Now we change the email property to driving license. But we don't have this property. So let's go to top of this view. The model behind this view is register view model. So we need to add this property in our view model. Put the cursor on the class name and press Ctrl B. Here we are. So prop string driving license. Also, we apply the required attribute here and display to add a space between driving and license. Didn't we use the required attribute just a minute ago? Yes, we did. But there we used it to override the conventions of Entity Framework while migrating the database. But here we're working on the view model. These are two separate things. So back to our view. Okay, now driving license is here. We should also change this email to driving license. And the final step. When this form is posted, we need to get this driving license and put it in our domain object. So let's go to controllers, account controller, and find register action in this drop-down list. The one that takes the view model. Okay, here we're initializing the application user. So I'm going to set the driving license here. Model.driving license. That's all we had to do. Let's test this. Build, back to the browser, refresh. I'm going to set the driving license, register. Beautiful. And now if you go back to our database and look at the ASP.NET users table, here's our new user. And if you scroll to the right, here's a driving license. Next, I'm going to show you how to implement social logins. These days, more and more users are using social logins to access different websites. So in this section, I'm going to show you how to enable users to log in using their Facebook account. Now, before we get into the mechanics, let me briefly explain the big picture. Facebook and other external authentication providers like Google, Twitter, Microsoft, and so on use an authentication protocol called OAuth, which stands for Open Authorization. Here's how OAuth works. Let's say John is a new staff member and wants to log into Vidly with his Facebook account. First of all, we need to register our application with Facebook to create some kind of partnership. Facebook will give us an API key and a secret, kind of like a username and password. We'll use this to talk to Facebook under the hood. Now, John wants to log in. When he clicks on Facebook login on our website, we will redirect him to Facebook and we'll use our API key and secret so Facebook knows this request is coming from Vidly. Now, to prevent a malicious user from finding our secret, we use HTTPS or Secure HTTP protocol. So the data exchange between these parties will be encrypted and no one can intercept this communication. Okay, now Joe is on Facebook. He logs in with his username and password. On Vidly, we don't know and we don't care what his Facebook credentials are. Once he logs into Facebook, Facebook tells him that Vidly wants to access some basic information about his account. Of course, we could ask for more, like the list of their friends, photos, and etc., but that's beyond the scope of what we're going to do. Now, that aside, the user can authorize Vidly to access this information. Since we registered Vidly with Facebook at the beginning, Facebook knows the address of Vidly. So it will redirect Joe back to Vidly, and it will also pass an authorization token. This authorization token tells Vidly that Facebook could successfully authenticate this user. Now on Vidly, we get this authorization token and send it back to Facebook with our API key and secret. We do this because a hacker may send a random authorization token to Vidly, so we need to verify that it really came from Facebook. That's why we send it back and tell Facebook, hey, it's me, Vidly. Did you really send me this authorization token? Facebook says, yes, I did. And then it will give us an access token. With this access token, we can access some parts of the user's profile, the parts we have permission to access. Now, all these low-level details I told you about, we never have to manually implement them. They're all baked into ASP.NET Identity, and using social logins in ASP.NET and MVC is incredibly easy. I told you all this stuff because I wanted you to have a better understanding of how everything works under the hood. And also, if you come across OAuth, you know what it is and how it works. Okay, now let's look at the mechanics. In order to use social logins, there are two steps we need to make. First, we need to enable SSL, so our communication with Facebook will be on a secure channel. And second, we need to register our application with Facebook to get an application ID and a secret. So in the next video, I will show you how to do these steps. Okay, to enable SSL, select the project in Solution Explorer and press F4. Here, set SSL enable to true. Now look at this URL. This is the address we use in order to establish a secure connection with Vidly. So copy this. Now back again in Solution Explorer, right-click the project and go to Properties. In the Web tab, scroll down. Here's our project URL. Replace this with this new address. HTTPS localhost port number 44300. Of course, this might be different on your machine, but it's probably the same. Now save. We don't need this anymore. Now if we run the application, we get this dialog box, which basically tells us that our project is using SSL, and in order to avoid getting warnings in the browser, we need to trust this dummy generated certificate in IIS Express. Click yes. Now we get this dialog box, which asks us if we want to install this certificate. Click yes. Okay, look at the address bar. Now the address of our project is https localhost 44300. And this icon here, the reason it's red is because we don't have a proper certificate. This is just a dummy certificate. If you deploy your application to a live web server, you need to get an official certificate from your web hosting company. Now let me show you something. Even though we are looking at the home page using HTTPS, I can still access this home page on a non-secure channel. So HTTP localhost, and this is the old port number. Look, it's still accessible. So back in Visual Studio, let's go to app_start, filter config. And here I'm going to add another filter. Require HTTPS attribute. With this, my application endpoints will no longer be available on an HTTP channel. Build. Back to the browser. Refresh. Look, we can't access the site anymore. So, HTTPS localhost 44300. Beautiful. Okay, now we need to register our application with Facebook. Head over to developers.facebook.com. If this is your first time using this service, you need to register yourself as a developer, and this is completely free. Once you log in, you will see this menu here, Add a new app. Here we need to select the platform, which can be iOS, Android, Facebook Canvas, or website. We're going to select website. Here we type the name of our application, Vidly. Create new Facebook app ID. And here you put your email. You select the category and create app ID. Now on this page, you see a piece of JavaScript, which is for Facebook SDK. We're not going to use this. Scroll down and here put the URL to our Vidly application. So on my machine, it's HTTPS localhost port number 44300. Next. Okay, we're done. Let's skip to developer dashboard. Okay, on the dashboard, you see an app ID and app secret here. Copy these values. Now back in the solution, go to app_start and open up startup.auth. Scroll down. Okay, look, we have this boilerplate code for using Facebook authentication. So I'm going to comment this out. And similarly, we're going to get this app secret and paste it here. Now, I'm not going to do that in the video because this is secret information. And that's pretty much all we had to do. So you see, using social logins is pretty easy. We just need to register our application with an external authentication provider, get an app ID and a secret, and then come to this class and enable this piece of code like use Facebook authentication. Now let's test this. If we go to the login page, scroll down, we see a new section here, use another service to log in. And you see the Facebook button. So all of this magic is happened by MVC framework. If you enable Google authentication, you will see another button here. Now in a real world scenario, you can go to the views, find the code that renders this button and replace it with an image. But for now, we don't have to worry about this. Now let me log in with my Facebook account. Okay, you see I'm redirected to Facebook. And Facebook is asking if I'm going to give Vidly access to my public profile information. So, okay. Okay, I've successfully authenticated with Facebook. So in the registration form, I no longer have to put in my password, only email. So let me put my email. We got a validation exception. The reason for this is because we added a new field to our application user. driving license. We added driving license to our standard registration form, but not on the registration form via social logins. So back to Visual Studio, we go to Views, Account, External Login Confirmation. That's the registration page when we use a social login provider. So let's open this. If you scroll down, you see we only have the email field here. So we need to add the driving license as well. I'm going to go and copy some code from register.cshtml. Okay, here's our form group. Copy. Back here. And I'm going to paste it right after the email field. Now again, the view model behind this view does not have this property. I'm going to use ReSharper to quickly create this property. So put the cursor here, Alt and Enter, Enter. So the view model for this view is external login confirmation view model. So this should be a string. Also, I'm going to apply these two attributes and set the display to driving license. Now, when this form is posted, again, we need to get this property from our view model and put it in our domain object. Let's go back to the view. Scroll up. Look, this is the action that this form will be posted to. So put the cursor here, Control B. Here we are. So at this point, when we create an application user, we want to initialize their driving license. Just like before. Now, let's test it one more time. Build. Back to the browser. I'm going to go to the login page again. Facebook. Now, the second time, we are not redirected to Facebook because earlier I authorized Bitly to access my public profile information. Now, put the email, driving license, register. Beautiful. Now, one last thing. If we go to SQL Server Object Explorer, look at the ASP.NET Users table. So here's my account with the email programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. But I also have another record in ASP.NET User Logins table. And this is because I logged in via Facebook. So my login provider is Facebook. Here's the provider key, which is the access token that ASP.NET Identity used to access my information on Facebook. And here's my user ID, which comes from ASP.NET Users table. Okay, now as an exercise, there are a few things I want you to do here. First, I'm going to show you, but you can also find a detailed description in the PDF I've attached to this lecture. In the registration form, add a new field called phone and make it required and limited to 50 characters. Do all the necessary steps and make sure when you register a new user, their phone number is saved in the database. Remember to apply the necessary changes in the other registration form, which is called by external login providers. Next, I want you to limit movie management operations to our store manager. Earlier in this section, I only protected the new movie page. So I want you to extend this to all other operations, including our movies API controller. And finally, to improve the structure of our project, take out the view model classes that you work with as part of this exercise, like external login confirmation view model, and put it in a separate file. This is really poor practice to have one file with so many classes. Same goes for the two classes we have in identity models, application user and application DB context. Extract these classes and put them in separate files. So that's it for this section. In case you forget, refer back to the PDF I've attached to this lecture. All the best and get started. So in this section, you learned how to implement authentication and authorization using ASP.NET Identity. More specifically, you learned how to restrict access to certain endpoints using the authorize attribute. You learned how to populate your database with users and roles. You learned how to extend ASP.NET Identity users and add profile data. And finally, you learned about OAuth and how to implement social logins in your applications. In the next section, we're going to look at performance optimization. So I will see you in the next section.